Let's face it, the majority of combat is boring! Yes, there's always the big set pieces where you're fighting across pits of lava, or you have to jump between pillars in a pool of acid, and these create the most epic moments that players still talk about for years to come. But most encounters, well, they just feel like they're all the same. It doesn't have to be that way. We may not be able to have every goblin fight take place inside of an active volcano, but we can spice up normal fights so they don't always feel like we're fighting in the big white room in the Matrix.
I didn't say it would be easy, Neo. I just said it would be the truth.
Stop. Let me out. Let me out!
Hello, Internet. I'm Steven the DM, and this is Basic Dungeoneering, where I give you some advice on how to be a better dungeon master. Today, I want to talk to you about terrain, specifically in combat scenarios. Terrain is often an afterthought when prepping for an adventure. When you're worried about plot hooks, fleshing out NPCs, and creating balanced encounters, well, putting terrain in a dungeon isn't high on the list. It's an easy trap to fall into, and every DM needs to decide how they prioritize their prep time. But in my games, combat usually ends up being about half the session, so putting a little bit of extra polish on the encounter can often decide whether my players had a fun night or not. It's important to remember that D&D is not a video game. In a video game, you can only interact with what the game allows you to interact with. Even an amazingly fun game like Skyrim that's known for being open and allowing you to do almost anything still has the same boring, repetitive dungeons. In D&D, the options are limitless. You can jump on the chandelier, duck under a table, roll between an enemy's legs, and this is why D&D will always be better than a video game, because there are no limits. It's why we keep coming back to the table and slinging dice week after week. And I'm not hating on video games here. I play way too many video games, ask my wife, and I love them all. But no matter how much I love Mass Effect 2, and it runs deep, I know that it will never compare to the best game of D&D I've ever played. Imagine a common tavern brawl. Yeah, sure, your barbarian can bare-knuckle box that half-orc without moving. But what if they could jump off the table for a pile drive, or grab a chair and break it on the half-orc's back? And I just realized I'm describing pro wrestling here.
What's going to happen here? Undertaker fighting back. He's fighting. Look out!
But when we add in terrain, now your barbarian has to move around tables and push through crowds of drunk spectators, adding a fun flavor to your combat and creating a sense of realism. Suddenly, not every combat feels exactly the same. Everyone has had that same boring fight against a boring monster in that boring dungeon room. You know the one. You open the door and find a group of orcs. Someone throws in a fireball to call the herd, and the remaining orcs rush the door, creating a bottleneck on both sides, where no one moves again. You then proceed to trade punches until one side, usually the orcs, falls down dead. If you're lucky, your DM has the last couple orcs surrender, mercifully ending the tedious combat. This is the orc in a room syndrome. You could replace the orc with any featureless monster and the room with any featureless dungeon. It's all the same fight, and it all resolves pretty much the same. No one remembers these fights years later because there's nothing to remember. Now there's one simple trick to making combat more fun. Put terrain on the map. Now, I'm not talking about the rulebook term of difficult terrain. I'm talking about cover and interactive objects on the battlefield. It's okay to have difficult terrain, but if it covers the entire battlefield with nothing else to complement it, then what's the point? All you did was cut everyone's speed in half without offering any new tactics. Here's a news story. You kick open the door to find a large room with a 30-foot ceiling supported by several stone pillars. Stacks of barrels and crates fill the room, but you can plainly see a few orcs in the center. They notice you in the doorway and shout an alarm before moving towards you. The party mage throws a fireball in the center of the room. It strikes an orc center mass, but his friends were able to duck behind the cover of a few crates. The crates and barrels are now ablaze, with the dungeon steadily filling with smoke. You can no longer see the orcs, but judging by the hail of crossbow bolts coming your way, they definitely see you. We have now created an interesting scenario. Even if the mage hadn't cast Fireball, we would still have a unique combat with orcs hiding behind crates and pillars. We even get to raise the stakes of the fight with the fire. The room is stone, so the orcs aren't at much risk of anything but smoke inhalation, so now your players also have to contend with the limited visibility as they move into the room to fight. When you put terrain on the map, you're creating decision points for your players. Does your ranger hide behind a pillar for cover, or climb onto a crate for better line of sight? Both options provide meaningful advantages and disadvantages for your players. But what is even better is having that terrain available allows your players to come up with their own creative strategies. And remember, it's not enough to just put terrain in the room. You also need your monsters to take advantage of it. Your monsters deserve cover just as much as your players. And it might make the fight more difficult, but your players will actually enjoy the combat because it gives them something to do. Melee fighters get to choose who they target, and ranged fighters get to maneuver to better positioning. They get to try out new tactics and strategies that they normally wouldn't be able to use. I'm not suggesting that every fight should have monsters with barricades and fortified positions, although I do think it should be more common. Combat terrain should normally be neutral, allowing either side to work it to their advantage. Give your players the same opportunity as the orcs to use those crates as cover. And terrain needs to be interactive. Tables can be flipped, bookshelves pulled over, bridges can collapse, and monsters break through walls and doors. Barrels should be full of alchemist fire. What's the point of having it all if your players don't get to trash it? The other side of the coin is that your monsters should be trashing the room as well. Dragons should be smashing pillars with their massive tails. Giants should be barreling through trees and breaking down walls. Even lowly orcs will be chopping through doors and kicking tables out of the way. By the end of your adventure, your dungeon should look like a hotel room after the Rolling Stones just checked out.
Hey, how'd you guys get a hotel room without putting a credit card down?
We did use a credit card, man. I took it out of your wallet.
Have you noticed how nice the weather is in most games? It seems like for most adventures, the weather is partly cloudy with a high of 75. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it's far easier for players to imagine, and less work for the DM, who has to constantly remind the players that they're wet and walking through mud. And it's perfectly fine for the majority of games, but sometimes weather can be really interesting in its own right. And it can be dynamic as well. A torrential rainstorm fills ditches so your players don't know how deep that puddle really is. It limits visibility even for those characters with dark vision. The mud makes for difficult terrain that might require an acrobatics check to stay standing. Halfway through the flight, a massive flood can begin to move through the battlefield, sweeping away players and monsters alike. There's a lot of variety that a single rainstorm can offer. But now imagine a dry thunderstorm with random lightning, or an ice storm pelting the players. Weather makes for great terrain because of this variety. Your big boss battle can have the stakes raised by taking place in a major storm, but your goblin ambush can benefit from the same situation. Traps also make for great combat terrain. I've talked about traps quite a bit already, but that's because they create interesting fights when used correctly, especially when your players catch on and discover the hazards on the map. Traps may be placed with the intention to use against your group, but a cunning player might turn the tables. And if this happens, go with it. Let your players push the kobolds into those bear traps. Players love feeling like they got the better of us, but we don't care because we have an infinite supply of kobolds to throw at them. So go ahead, let your players use that lever that drops your little guys into a crocodile-infested pit.
Okay, why does she even have that lever?
And terrain goes beyond obstacles in the room. Why not add some verticality to combat? Most dungeons tend to be a single level, so switch things up and throw in some balconies with snipers overlooking the room. Bonus points if you have bookshelves beneath the balconies, allowing your players to climb up to that level as well. And don't be afraid to be blunt with your players about the mechanics of a situation. It's okay to tell a player that their character would know they would gain a serious strategic benefit by being on that balcony. There are certain things characters would instinctively know, and it's your responsibility as a DM to tell them, not wait for the players to ask. Raising the roof on your dungeon also lets you bring in new monsters for your parties to face. Flying creatures suddenly have room to maneuver and are a threat again. Beholders are no longer low-hanging piñatas. Why would a beholder build a dungeon that's only 10 foot tall anyways? So maybe next time your party is ambushed in the forest, the goblins weren't just hiding in the undergrowth, but also posted archers high up in the trees to rain down arrows on your party. If you have a cave, have some Moria-style goblins crawling along the walls, harassing the party's every move. Our intention while using combat terrain isn't to make the fights more difficult. We're trying to make fights memorable. Your players should be given every opportunity to take advantage of their surroundings because the orcs are going to be doing the same thing. This is how combat feels fluid, your monsters feel intelligent, and your players feel heroic. My current campaign is online on a virtual tabletop, and it tends to be very map heavy. I use a lot of tokens for terrain the same way I use tokens for players and NPCs, so it's easy to set up and interact with. My players tend to get a kick out of seeing the map change and respond to the fight. Lightning will leave crates on fire, and vine blights send out tangles of roots across the map. It's a lot of fun and actually not that much work. And if I start a home game, I can use those same maps and tokens with a TV or a projector. I get most of my maps through Patreon, and I'm a patron of a few different artists, but there's a few that really stand out. I have 3 that I always check first when I need a new map. Dungeon Master, 2-Minute Tabletop, and Neutral Party. All 3 have beautiful styles that invoke emotion and tension, while offering many different scenarios and strategies for each map. I'll put links down below so you can check them out. The great thing about all 3 of their Patreons is that if you give them $1 or $2, you have access to their entire backlog of maps that they've released. It's an insane amount of content that you get for less than the price of a coffee. A couple of them also release tile sets so you can customize and make brand new maps in their art style. If you enjoy using maps and you're one of the lucky few with a consistent home game, then it is very much worth it to buy a dry erase mat. You don't need to be an artist, just scribble out the basics of the room and where the terrain is. If you can draw a square and a circle, you can put crates and barrels on a map. Even a high quality production like Relics and Rarities will still use a dry erase map because they're so convenient. If you tend to run in Theater of the Mind, then you're in even better shape because you have an unlimited budget. The sky is the limit and you can make your terrain as exciting and unique as possible. If you play using Theater of the Mind and you don't use terrain in combat, then you might as well be fighting nameless ninjas on the holodeck in a plain black room with a yellow grid. What's the point?
Aikido one.
The key thing to remember is that we want players to have several approaches to any combat. It will add variety into your game and keep your players coming back week after week. If you found this video helpful, please hit that sub button and give me a thumbs up. My next video will be a Monsterology video where I do a deep dive into the tactics about D&D's most iconic monsters. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm Steven.